For weeks, I felt something was wrong. He'd wait until everyone was asleep, then disappear into her room. I needed proof, so I hid a camera. But when I watched the recording the next morning, I wished I hadn't. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who spies on her own husband. But there I was, 58 years old, sitting in my darkened bedroom at 2 in the morning, watching grainy footage on my phone that made my blood run cold. The camera I'd hidden behind our daughter Kenna's bookshelf showed everything. My husband Dennis, the man I'd loved for 35 years, was creeping into our 32-year-old daughter's room every single night. His movements were deliberate, practiced, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He would stand there for minutes, just watching her sleep, then move toward her dresser and start going through her things. Hello everyone, before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My hands trembled as I watched him pull out envelopes from under her clothes, rifling through them with the kind of urgency that told me this wasn't innocent. Kenna had moved back home 6 months ago after her divorce, broken and vulnerable, and I'd welcomed her with open arms. We'd turned the guest room into her sanctuary, a place where she could heal. But now, watching Dennis violate that space night after night, I felt something inside me shatter. This wasn't the man I married. Or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see it all these years. The footage showed him pocketing something, then carefully closing the drawer exactly as he'd found it. He moved like a practiced thief, checking his surroundings, listening for any sound of movement. My stomach twisted as I realized this explained so many things. Kenna's recent paranoia about misplacing things. Her confusion about money she swore she'd saved. The way she'd started locking her door, only to find it mysteriously unlocked in the morning. I'd told her she was imagining things, that the stress of her divorce was making her forgetful. What kind of mother was I? I wanted to storm into that room right then, to scream in rage and demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the years of conditioning to keep the peace, to not make waves, to be the perfect wife. Or maybe it was something deeper, a cold calculation forming in my mind. If I confronted him now, he'd lie. He'd gaslight me the way he'd probably been deciding Kenna. I needed more evidence. I needed to understand the full scope of what he'd been doing. So I sat there in the darkness, watching my husband betray our daughter, and I began to plan. The next morning, Dennis came down for breakfast like nothing had happened, kissing my cheek and asking what I was making for dinner. I smiled and poured his coffee, playing the role I'd perfected over 3 decades of marriage. But inside, I was already counting the hours until nightfall, until I could watch that camera again. Because something told me that what I'd seen was only the beginning. And I was right. That night's footage would reveal something so much worse than theft. Something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the man sleeping beside me. As I watched him climb the stairs that second night, I whispered a promise to myself and to my daughter: whatever he was hiding, whatever darkness he brought into our home, I would expose it. Even if it meant destroying the life I'd spent 35 years building. Even if it meant admitting I'd failed to protect my own child. But first, I needed to know the truth. And the truth, as I would soon discover, was more twisted than anything I could have imagined. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really started, though I didn't see it as a nightmare then. I was 23 when I met Dennis Calloway at a church barbecue in our small Texas town of Millbrook. He was 25, charming, with a steady job at the manufacturing plant and a smile that made my knees weak. My mama said he was a good catch, a man who would provide and protect. In 1990, that's all a young woman from our town could hope for. We were married within a year, and Kenna arrived 2 years later. Those early years felt like a dream. Dennis worked hard, came home every night, never raised his voice or his hand to me. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough for Kenna to play in. I stayed home with our daughter, joined the PTA, hosted book clubs, and perfected my role as Dennis's wife. Everyone in town said we were the perfect couple. The Callaways, always smiling in our Sunday best, always first to volunteer for community events. But perfection, I've learned, is often just a mask hiding rot underneath. Dennis was particular about things. The house had to be spotless, dinner on the table at 6 sharp, my appearance maintained even when it was just the two of us at home. I told myself he had high standards because he cared, because he wanted the best for us. When he'd get angry about a dish left in the sink or a shirt not ironed properly, I'd apologize and do better. That's what good wives did. My own mother had taught me that keeping a man happy meant keeping a home perfect. So I perfected everything, smoothing over every rough edge, never questioning why I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own house. Kenna grew up watching this dance between her father and me. She was a bright child, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries. Dennis didn't like that. He wanted her to be quiet, obedient, perfect like the rest of our life. When she was 10, I caught him going through her diary, reading her private thoughts. I'd questioned it gently, and he'd exploded. Told me that parents had a right to know everything about their children, that privacy was a privilege earned through obedience. I'd backed down, as I always did. Now, decades later, I wonder how many times I failed my daughter by choosing peace over protection. As Kenna grew into a teenager, the tension between her and Dennis intensified. She wanted independence. He wanted control. I played mediator, always smoothing things over, always making excuses for why her father was so strict. She couldn't date until she was 17. Her college choices were limited to schools within driving distance. Her boyfriends were scrutinized and usually found wanting. When she finally moved out at 22 to live with her boyfriend Marcus, Dennis barely spoke to her for months. I told myself it was normal father-daughter conflict, that he was just protective. But it wasn't protection. It was possession. Marcus seemed like a good man when they married 5 years later. Stable, kind, with a good job and insurance. But the marriage crumbled after 7 years. Kenna never told me why, just that it was over and she needed to come home. She arrived with 3 suitcases and eyes that couldn't meet mine, all that brightness from her childhood dimmed to something hollow. Dennis had insisted she take the guest room, saying it was temporary until she got back on her feet. I'd agreed, grateful my daughter was home where I could take care of her. I never suspected that her father had been waiting for exactly this moment. That his interest in having her home had nothing to do with parental concern. That I'd invited my daughter into a trap I didn't even know existed. For 3 weeks, I watched those recordings every night, and a horrifying pattern emerged. Dennis would wait until he thought I was asleep, then slip out of our bed with practiced silence. He'd enter Kenna's room through the door she thought she'd locked, using a key I'd never known he had. First, he'd go through her dresser, taking cash from envelopes she kept hidden under her clothes. Small amounts, $20 or $30 at a time, nothing she'd immediately notice was missing. But it was adding up. I'd been keeping a log, and in 3 weeks, he'd stolen over $400 from our own daughter. But the money wasn't the worst part. After taking the cash, Dennis would move to her desk and open her laptop. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but I could see him scrolling through something, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He'd take photos with his phone, quick snapshots of what he was reading. It took me a few nights to realize what he was doing. He was reading her emails, her messages, photographing her private conversations. He was systematically invading every aspect of her privacy, documenting her life like she was some kind of suspect under surveillance. One night, I watched him go through her purse, memorizing her passwords from a small notebook she kept. Another night, he rifled through papers on her desk, photographing bank statements and job applications. He spent nearly 20 minutes in her room each visit, methodical and thorough, checking the same places in the same order. This wasn't impulsive. This was routine. And the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd probably been doing this since the day she moved back. Maybe even before, during her childhood. How many years had my husband been spying on our daughter? The next day, I tried to act normal, but everything felt different. I watched Dennis at the breakfast table, reading his newspaper, buttering his toast, and I saw a stranger. This man who'd shared my bed for 35 years, who I thought I knew better than anyone, was a complete mystery to me. Who steals from their own child? Who violates their daughter's privacy night after night? I wanted to confront him, to throw the evidence in his face and demand answers. But something held me back. A growing certainty that there was more I didn't know, more I needed to understand before I made my move. Kenna came down for breakfast looking tired, dark circles under her eyes. She'd been having trouble sleeping, she said, feeling like someone was watching her. Dennis assured her it was just stress from the divorce, that she was safe at home with us. The way he said it, so smooth and concerned, made my skin crawl. I watched him watch her, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. The way his eyes tracked her movements. The intensity of his attention. It wasn't fatherly concern. It was something else entirely, something that made my mouth go dry with fear. That night, I added a second camera to Kenna's room, angling it toward the door so I could see his face more clearly. I needed to see his expression, to understand what was driving this obsession. And what I saw in those recordings, the look on his face as he violated our daughter's privacy, would haunt me forever. It wasn't guilt or shame. It was satisfaction. Like he was entitled to this, like she was something he owned rather than someone he'd raised. My husband wasn't just stealing from Kenna. He was treating her like property, like something he had a right to control and monitor. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had to stop him before whatever this was escalated into something even worse. Thanks for staying with us through this chapter. If this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us bring more stories to light. Also, drop a comment and let us know, have you ever discovered something shocking about someone you trusted? We read every single comment. Now, let's continue. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep properly. Every moment felt like I was acting in a play where I was the only one who didn't know my lines. I'd spent 35 years being Mrs. Dennis Calloway, the perfect wife, the woman who never questioned or challenged. But those recordings had awakened something in me I didn't know existed. Anger. Not the quick flash of irritation I'd sometimes feel when Dennis criticized my cooking or complained about the house. This was deeper, colder, a rage that burned in my chest like ice rather than fire. I started paying attention to things I'd always overlooked. The way Dennis would casually ask Kenna about her day, then later I'd see him checking his phone, probably reviewing the photos he'd taken of her messages. The way he'd offer to help with her job search, then use that information to monitor her every application. He'd even suggested she use our home office computer instead of her laptop, saying it was faster. Now I understood he wanted easier access to her information. Everything he did was calculated, designed to maintain control while appearing helpful. My sister Darla was the first person I told. We'd met for lunch at the diner on 5th Street, and I'd broken down halfway through my chicken salad sandwich. I showed her the recordings on my phone, watching her face shift from confusion to horror. She'd never liked Dennis much, always saying there was something off about him, but I'd defended him for decades. Now, as she watched him systematically violate our daughter's privacy, she gripped my hand so hard it hurt. She said I needed to tell Kenna immediately, get her out of that house, and leave Dennis. Simple advice from someone who saw the situation clearly, unclouded by 35 years of conditioning. But leaving wasn't simple for me. I'd never worked outside the home. Our house was in both our names, but Dennis controlled all the finances. I had a joint checking account I used for groceries and household expenses, but the savings, the retirement accounts, everything substantial was in his name. Over the years, he'd explained this was smarter for tax purposes, that he was protecting our assets. I'd believed him because I'd been taught to believe him. Now I realized I'd been systematically cut off from financial independence. If I left, I'd be starting over at 58 with nothing. But staying meant betraying my daughter. Again. That evening, I called the one person I thought could help, my nephew Jason, who was a lawyer in Dallas. I explained the situation carefully, clinically, like it was happening to someone else. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me the hard truth. What Dennis was doing was probably not illegal. Kenna was an adult living in his house, and unless I could prove he was using the information to harm her financially or legally, the police wouldn't be interested. The theft was minimal, difficult to prove, and unlikely to result in charges. My husband could violate our daughter's privacy with near impunity. Jason said my best option was documentation and divorce. Get everything recorded, screenshot the evidence, prepare for a custody battle over assets since criminal justice wasn't an option. He explained Texas divorce law, community property, how I was entitled to half of everything Dennis had accumulated during our marriage. But he also warned me, divorce would be ugly, expensive, and Dennis would fight dirty. Men who exerted this kind of control didn't let go easily. I'd need to be strategic, build a case, protect myself and Kenna before Dennis realized what was happening. As I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. Dennis had spent decades controlling me, shaping me into his perfect wife. Now I was going to use that perfect wife as a disguise while I dismantled everything he'd built. And he wouldn't see me coming until it was too late. I chose a Saturday afternoon when Dennis was at his weekly poker game with the boys from the plant. Kenna was in the kitchen making tea when I asked her to sit down with me. She looked worried immediately, probably thinking I was going to lecture her about finding a job or moving out. Instead, I pulled out my phone and showed her the first video. I watched my daughter's face transform as she recognized her room, her things, her father moving through her space like a ghost. Her hand went to her mouth, and she made a sound I'll never forget, something between a gasp and a sob. The full truth came pouring out of her then, 3 decades of secrets she'd been holding. Dennis had been invading her privacy since she was a child. Reading her diaries, going through her things, monitoring her phone calls when she was a teenager. She thought it would stop when she moved out, but even during her marriage, he'd find ways to stay involved. He'd show up at her house unannounced, let himself in with a key she didn't know he'd copied, snoop through her mail when she wasn't looking. Marcus had noticed and hated it, confronted Dennis once about boundaries. That confrontation had been the beginning of the end for her marriage. Kenna told me she'd come home because she had nowhere else to go, but also because she'd hoped being back under our roof would somehow make her father stop. That proximity would shame him into normalcy. Instead, it had gotten worse. She'd noticed money missing, items moved, her laptop's history showing sites she'd never visited. She'd started to think she was losing her mind, that the divorce had broken something in her brain. The relief in her voice when she realized she wasn't crazy was overshadowed by the horror of understanding what her father truly was. A man obsessed with control, willing to gaslight his own daughter to maintain it. But there was more. Kenna pulled up her shirt sleeve and showed me faint scars on her inner arm. She'd started cutting herself when she was 16, she said, because it was the only pain she could control. Dennis had caught her once, and instead of getting her help, he'd taken photos of the cuts and threatened to show them to everyone at church if she didn't stop. He'd said she was embarrassing the family, that people would think he was a bad father. So she'd learned to hide it better, cutting in places no one would see. The scars were old now, healed, but the damage he'd done to her psyche was still raw and bleeding. I held my daughter while she cried, and I cried with her. All those years I'd told myself Dennis was just strict, just old-fashioned, just protective. I'd been protecting him, not her. I'd chosen my marriage over my child's well-being again and again, and now I had to face the full weight of that failure. Kenna asked me what I was going to do, and I told her the truth. I was going to make sure her father never controlled either of us again. But I needed her help. I needed her to pretend everything was normal for just a little while longer while I built my case and prepared our escape. She agreed, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She'd learned not to trust adults to protect her, learned that the people who were supposed to keep her safe would instead use her pain as leverage. I promised her this time would be different. This time, I was on her side completely, no compromises, no protecting Dennis's reputation or our marriage. For the first time in my life, I was choosing my daughter over everything else. And as I said those words, I felt something inside me break free. The perfect wife was dead. The mother my daughter deserved was just being born. And she was going to be relentless. If this story is hitting home, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment telling us what you think will happen next, and share this with someone who needs to hear about choosing courage over comfort. Your engagement means everything. Now, back to the story. I became a woman possessed. Every day while Dennis was at work, I documented everything. I went through our financial records, finding irregularities I'd never questioned before. Large cash withdrawals Dennis claimed were for poker games or hunting trips. Credit card statements showing charges I didn't recognize. A safety deposit box at the bank I didn't know existed. When I visited the bank and explained I needed access to our joint box, the clerk looked confused. She checked her records and told me there was no joint box, only one in Dennis's name alone. Whatever was in there, he deliberately kept hidden from me. I created a secret email account and started forwarding documents to myself. Bank statements, tax returns, deeds, insurance policies, everything I could find. Jason had given me a list of what I'd need for the divorce, and I was checking items off methodically. I also set up a separate checking account at a different bank, one Dennis didn't know about, and started siphoning small amounts from our grocery money each week. $20 here, $30 there, building an escape fund. It felt like stealing from my own marriage, but I was just taking back what was partly mine to begin with. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy. Every morning, I still made Dennis his breakfast exactly how he liked it. Still kissed him goodbye at the door. Still asked about his day when he came home. At night, I still lay beside him in bed, feeling his warmth and fighting the revulsion that now accompanied his touch. He had no idea that the obedient wife he'd molded for 35 years was systematically planning his downfall. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me suspiciously, and my heart would race, but then I'd smile and ask if he wanted more coffee, and the suspicion would fade. Kenna was struggling to maintain the charade. I'd catch her flinching when Dennis entered a room, see her hands shake when he spoke to her. But she was trying, for both of us. She'd even started leaving small amounts of cash in obvious places, bait to keep Dennis's routine predictable while we planned. The recordings continued every night, building a library of evidence of his systematic invasion of her privacy. Jason said it might not be enough for criminal charges, but it would be devastating in divorce court, especially when combined with the financial irregularities I was uncovering. 3 weeks into my investigation, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been going through old tax returns, trying to understand where our money had actually gone over the years. We should have had more in retirement savings, more equity in the house, more to show for 3 decades of Dennis's steady employment. But the numbers didn't add up. And then I found it, a second mortgage on our house taken out 5 years ago, something Dennis had never mentioned. $50,000, borrowed against the home we'd supposedly owned free and clear. The money had been deposited into an account I didn't have access to, and there was no record of where it had gone. That night, I confronted the records instead of my husband, spreading papers across the guest room bed while Kenna watched. We traced the money through bank statements I'd managed to copy during a visit when the clerk stepped away. The $50,000 had been withdrawn in chunks over 2 years, always cash, always substantial amounts. No explanation, no paper trail of what it was used for. Dennis had stolen from our future, from the retirement we'd supposedly been building together, and hidden it. Whether he'd gambled it away, spent it on something shameful, or hidden it somewhere, I didn't know yet. But I would find out. Because now I wasn't just fighting for my freedom and Kenna's safety. I was fighting to recover everything he'd taken from us. And I was just getting started. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Darla had been doing her own investigating, talking to people around town, being subtle about it. She called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice shaking. She'd had coffee with Patricia Morrison, whose husband worked with Dennis at the plant. Patricia had mentioned, casually, that Dennis often worked late on Thursdays, sometimes staying until 8 or 9 at night. This confused Darla because Dennis was always home by 6:30, like clockwork. So where was he going every Thursday evening for 2 or 3 hours? That Thursday, I told Dennis I was going to Darla's for dinner and a movie. Instead, I parked down the street from the plant and waited. At 5:15, Dennis walked out with the other men, got in his truck, and drove away. But instead of heading toward home, he drove to the old part of town, near the shuttered textile mill. My heart hammered as I followed from a distance, watching him pull into a storage facility I'd never known existed. He punched in a code, drove through the gate, and parked in front of Unit 247. I waited until he went inside before I crept closer. The units didn't have windows, but his truck was still running, the driver's door open like he'd be quick. I could hear him moving things inside, the sound of metal scraping on concrete. 5 minutes later, he emerged carrying a black duffel bag, tossed it in the truck bed, and locked the unit. I ducked behind another unit as he drove past, then quickly photographed the unit number and the lock. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get a clear picture. I followed him from the storage facility to a casino 40 minutes outside town, one of those Native American gaming places that had popped up in recent years. Dennis parked, grabbed the duffel bag, and walked inside like he owned the place. I waited 10 minutes before following, my heart in my throat. The casino was crowded, loud, full of cigarette smoke and the electronic sounds of slot machines. I found Dennis at a high-stakes poker table, the duffel bag at his feet. As I watched from across the room, he unzipped it and pulled out stacks of banded cash, buying in for what looked like thousands of dollars. So this is where our retirement money had gone. Where the $50,000 from the house had disappeared to. Where the cash he'd been stealing from Kenna was ending up. My husband was a gambling addict, and he'd been funding his addiction with money stolen from his family. I watched him play for an hour, seeing him win some hands and lose others, his face intense and focused in a way I'd never seen at home. This was where he was truly himself, I realized. Not in our perfect house with his perfect wife, but here, where he could risk and control and lose everything without consequence. Except there were consequences. And they were about to catch up with him. I left before he noticed me and drove home in a daze. The pieces were falling into place now. The control, the stealing, the secrecy, all of it feeding an addiction he'd hidden for years. I called Jason immediately, told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, then said this changed everything. A gambling addiction, money stolen from the marital assets, lying about it for years, this could get me more than half in the divorce. This could get me nearly everything, especially combined with the evidence of his treatment of Kenna. We just needed to prove it, document it, make it impossible for him to deny. The next Thursday, I didn't follow him. Instead, I went to the storage facility with bolt cutters I'd borrowed from Darla's garage. My heart was pounding as I approached Unit 247, looking around for security cameras. There was one near the entrance, but not in this row. I cut the lock, my hand steadier than I expected, and pulled up the door. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Not just evidence of gambling, but something so much worse. Something that would destroy Dennis Calloway completely and set me and Kenna free forever. We're at a crucial turning point. If you're invested in seeing justice served, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Comment below, what do you think she found in that storage unit? We love reading your theories. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's see this through to the end together. The storage unit wasn't large, maybe 10 by 10, but it was packed with evidence of a life I'd known nothing about. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and when I opened them, I found years of financial records, all carefully organized and completely separate from our household accounts. Dennis had a second bank account, multiple credit cards in his name only, and statements showing a pattern of gambling losses that made my stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, he'd lost over $200,000 at various casinos. $200,000 that should have been our retirement, our security, our future. But the money trail wasn't the worst of it. In the back corner, I found boxes of surveillance equipment, some still in packaging, some clearly used. Cameras, recording devices, software for monitoring phones and computers, all the tools of someone who'd made a hobby of spying. There were old phones, too, ones I recognized as having belonged to Kenna over the years. Dennis had kept them, probably mining them for data even after she'd moved on to new devices. The obsession with controlling our daughter went back further and deeper than I'd imagined. Then I found the notebooks. 3 of them, spanning years, filled with Dennis's handwriting. I opened the first one with shaking hands and started reading. They were journals, but not normal ones. These were detailed logs of Kenna's life, day by day, year by year. What time she came home from school. Who she talked to on the phone. Where she went on weekends. As she got older, the entries became darker, filled with Dennis's anger at her independence, his resentment of her boyfriends, his obsession with maintaining control. On one page, he'd written, "She thinks she can have secrets from me. She needs to learn that nothing is hidden from her father." Nothing. But it was the 4th box that made me physically ill. Inside were dozens of USB drives, each labeled with dates. I grabbed one at random and my laptop from my car, my hands trembling as I plugged it in. The drive contained videos, hundreds of them, all of Kenna. Some were clearly from hidden cameras in her house, showing her in her bedroom over the years, changing clothes, studying, crying, living her private life under her father's invisible surveillance. Others were screen recordings of her computer activity, her social media accounts, her emails, her text messages. Dennis had documented years of her life without her knowledge or consent. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit and cried. Not just for what Dennis had done, but for my own blindness. All those years when Kenna had seemed anxious, paranoid, unable to trust, I'd thought she was being difficult. I'd never considered that her instincts were right, that she'd been living under surveillance her entire life. My husband hadn't just invaded her privacy, he'd systematically documented her existence like she was a subject in an experiment rather than his daughter. The level of violation was almost incomprehensible. I spent 3 hours in that unit, photographing everything, copying files onto USB drives I'd brought, creating a complete record of Dennis's secret life. Jason had told me to document everything, and I did, methodically and thoroughly. Every bank statement, every notebook entry, every video file, I created a backup of it all. By the time I was finished, I had enough evidence to destroy Dennis Calloway in court and possibly send him to prison. The gambling alone could be considered theft of marital assets. The surveillance of Kenna, especially the videos from when she was a minor, could be criminal. I had everything I needed to end this marriage and protect my daughter. As I locked up the unit with a new lock I'd brought and threw the old one away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For weeks, I'd been terrified, angry, uncertain. But now I had clarity. I knew exactly what Dennis was, exactly what he'd done, and exactly how I was going to stop him. Tomorrow, I'd take everything to Jason. We'd file for divorce, get a restraining order, and if possible, press charges. Dennis would come home to an empty house and a lawsuit that would strip him of everything he'd spent his life building. And he would finally understand what it felt like to have your entire world taken apart by someone you trusted. Just like he'd done to me and Kenna. Justice was coming. And it was wearing the face of the perfect wife he'd underestimated for 35 years. I met Jason at his office on Friday morning with 3 USB drives and a folder of documents an inch thick. He spent 4 hours reviewing everything while I sat in his waiting room, drinking bad coffee and trying to keep my hands from shaking. When he finally called me back in, his face was grim. He said what Dennis had done was worse than he'd initially thought. The surveillance videos, especially the ones from when Kenna was underage, were likely criminal. The theft of marital assets for gambling was grounds for me to claim more than my fair share in divorce. We had enough to destroy him. But Jason warned me, when we filed, we needed to move fast. Dennis would be served papers at work, and the moment he realized what was happening, he'd likely try to hide assets, destroy evidence, or worse. We needed to get a restraining order immediately, freeze the bank accounts, and get Kenna somewhere safe before Dennis even knew what was coming. I needed to be prepared for him to fight back, possibly violently. Men who controlled their families the way Dennis had controlled us didn't surrender easily. They escalated. That evening, I told Kenna everything. We sat in her room, the one with the hidden cameras. Dennis thought he was the only one watching, and I explained the plan. We'd be filing on Monday morning. She'd stay with Darla that weekend. I'd pack my essential documents and some clothes, everything I couldn't bear to lose, and put them in my trunk. On Monday, when Dennis went to work, I'd leave. Just drive away from 35 years of marriage and never look back. The house, the furniture, the life I'd built, I was walking away from all of it. Because none of it was worth staying for. Kenna cried, but not from sadness. From relief. She said she'd been waiting her whole life for me to choose her, and she'd almost given up hope that I ever would. That hit me harder than anything else in this nightmare. My daughter had grown up believing I'd never protect her, and I'd proven her right again and again. But I was protecting her now, and I'd spend the rest of my life making up for the years I didn't. We held each other and cried, not for what we were losing but for what we were finally going to gain, freedom. Saturday passed in a surreal haze. Dennis was home, puttering around the garage, watching football, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit. I made his meals, did the laundry, played my role perfectly for the last time. That night, after he was asleep, I moved the last of my important documents to my car. My mother's jewelry. The photos of Kenna as a baby. My birth certificate and social security card. Everything that mattered fit into 2 small boxes. 35 years of marriage reduced to 2 boxes that could fit in a trunk. Sunday, I went to church alone. Dennis had never been particularly religious, but I'd gone every Sunday for decades, part of maintaining the perfect family image. I sat in my usual pew and listened to Pastor Frank preach about courage and faith, and I felt like he was speaking directly to me. After the service, I stopped to talk to Martha Kennedy, the widow who ran the prayer group. I told her I might not be at church for a while, that things were changing in my life. She took my hand and said she'd seen me sitting there for 30 years looking like a woman carrying the weight of the world. She said she'd be praying that I'd finally put it down. I think she knew. I think a lot of people knew and just didn't say anything. That's how it works in small towns. Everyone knows, but no one interferes. Until it's too late. That night was the longest of my life. I lay beside Dennis in our bed for the last time, listening to him breathe, thinking about all the nights I'd spent next to this man without really knowing him. In the morning, everything would change. He'd wake up, go to work, and be served divorce papers by a process server Jason had hired. By the time he read them, I'd be gone, Kenna would be safe, and the life he'd built on control and secrets would start crumbling. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited for dawn and freedom. Monday morning arrived like a promise finally kept. I made Dennis breakfast for the last time, watched him eat his eggs and read his paper, and kissed his cheek when he left for work at 7:30. The moment his truck disappeared down the street, I called Kenna. She'd spent the weekend at Darla's, and now she came home to help me finish packing. We worked quickly, efficiently, loading my car with the boxes I'd already prepared and a few last items I couldn't leave behind. By 9 o'clock, I was ready to leave the house on Maple Street forever. But before I left, I did one final thing. I went to Dennis's home office, the room he'd always kept locked, and used the key I'd found in his wallet while he slept. Inside, I found exactly what I'd expected: more surveillance equipment, more notebooks documenting Kenna's life, and a safe I couldn't open. I photographed everything, added the photos to the evidence file, and left the door wide open. I wanted him to know I'd been there. I wanted him to understand that all his secrets were exposed, that the control he'd wielded so carefully for decades had slipped through his fingers while he wasn't looking. Jason called at 10:15 to confirm Dennis had been served. He'd been in a meeting with his supervisor when the process server arrived, and according to the server, Dennis's face had gone white as he read the papers. He tried calling my cell immediately, but I'd blocked his number. He'd left work and driven home to find an empty house, my closet cleared out, and that open office door showing him I knew everything. Jason said we needed to be prepared for him to show up at Darla's, to call the police if he did. The restraining order wouldn't be in effect until tomorrow, but Darla's husband Pete was a big man who didn't like Dennis much. We'd be safe there. Dennis did come, of course. He arrived at Darla's at 2 in the afternoon, pounding on the door, demanding to see me. Pete answered and told him to leave or he'd call the police. Through the window, I could see Dennis's face, red with rage, spit flying as he shouted about betrayal and lies and how I'd regret this. He wasn't the calm, controlled man I'd lived with for 35 years. He was unhinged, desperate. The mask finally dropped. Pete made good on his threat and called the police. Dennis was escorted away with a warning that if he returned, he'd be arrested. The divorce took 8 months to finalize, and they were the hardest months of my life. Dennis fought everything, denied everything, claimed the surveillance was for Kenna's protection, that the gambling was under control, that I was making him out to be a monster when he'd only ever provided for his family. But Jason was relentless. We had the evidence, the videos, the financial records, everything Dennis had meticulously documented himself. The judge, a woman named Sandra Martinez who'd seen her share of controlling husbands, was not sympathetic to Dennis's claims. In the end, I got the house, 3/4 of the retirement accounts, and half the value of Dennis's pension. The judge ruled that his theft of marital assets for gambling entitled me to more than the standard 50-50 split. Dennis also had to pay restitution to Kenna for the money he'd stolen from her, plus damages for emotional distress. The surveillance videos, particularly those from when she was a minor, resulted in criminal charges. Dennis took a plea deal, 5 years probation, mandatory therapy, and a restraining order keeping him from contacting Kenna or me for 10 years. Kenna and I rebuilt our lives slowly, carefully. She started therapy, working through decades of violation and control. I went too, learning how to be a person outside of being Dennis's wife, discovering who Margaret Calloway was when she wasn't performing perfection. We kept the house on Maple Street, but we redecorated it completely, painted over every wall, replaced every piece of furniture that reminded us of him. We turned his office into a library, filling it with books and light, exorcising his ghost with knowledge and beauty. I got a job at the local library, something I'd always wanted to do but Dennis had said was unnecessary. At 59, I was starting a career for the first time, and I loved it. Kenna went back to school, getting a degree in psychology with the goal of helping other women escape controlling relationships. We built a life together based on honesty and support rather than secrets and surveillance. Some days were hard. Some days we both struggled with the weight of what Dennis had done, the years we'd lost to his obsession with control. But we were free. That was what mattered. Every morning, I woke up in my house, in my bed, in a room without hidden cameras or locks I didn't control, and I felt grateful. The story of what Dennis did spread through Millbrook, and some people blamed me for airing our dirty laundry, for destroying a man's reputation. But others, mostly women, came to me quietly and shared their own stories of control, of husbands who monitored and restricted and slowly eroded their sense of self. I realized Dennis wasn't unique. He was just one example of a pattern that played out in houses all over town, all over the country. Looking back now, 2 years later, I'm not the same woman who set up that hidden camera in her daughter's room. That Margaret was afraid, uncertain, trained to please and accommodate at the cost of her own dignity. This Margaret knows her worth. She chose her daughter over her marriage, truth over comfort, freedom over security. It wasn't easy. Nothing about leaving Dennis was easy. But it was right. And every day, when I see Kenna smiling, healing, building a life free from surveillance and control, I know I made the right choice. If you're reading this, if you're living with someone who controls you, who monitors you, who makes you feel like you're losing your mind because they're so good at hiding their manipulation, please know this, you're not crazy. Your instincts are right. And you deserve better. It doesn't matter how long you've been together, how old you are, or how impossible escape seems. There's always a way out. It might be hard. It might be terrifying. But freedom is worth it. I promise you, freedom is worth it. Thank you for staying with us through Margaret and Kenna's entire story. If this resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful true stories that need to be told. And if you're going through something similar, please reach out to local resources, talk to someone you trust, and know that you're not alone. Drop a comment and let us know what you think about Margaret's journey. Did she do the right thing? What would you have done? We read every comment and your thoughts matter to us. Remember, you are stronger than you know, and you deserve a life free from fear and control. Thank you for being here.